opening the city at the edge of night. The street is narrow, so narrow that if you stretched both arms wide, you could nearly touch the plastered walls on either side. Above you, the upper stories of the buildings lean toward one another, their wooden shutters drawn, their window frames dark and silent. The stone beneath your feet is worn smooth by a million footsteps, cobbled, uneven, still holding the warmth of the afternoon sun that has long since set. You can feel it through the soles of your sandals, or perhaps you have no sandals and you feel it directly. The faint residual heat of a city that has absorbed the sun all day and has not yet fully let it go. It is night, not the managed, electrical night of a world you know, with its orange sky glow and its distant traffic hum. This is a different kind of night. Above you, between the roof lines of the buildings, you can see a strip of sky, and the sky is astonishing. It is deep and thick with stars. You have never in your life seen so many, because the city below them produces no light of its own, no great glowing wash that would push the stars back into invisibility. Rome in this hour is a city of small fires, individual lamps in individual windows, torches at individual doorways. The city glows, but it glows in pieces, warm and separate and alive, and between those pieces there is real darkness. You are standing in that darkness now. Around you, the sounds of the night are beginning. Somewhere ahead, perhaps 2 or 3 streets away, you can hear wheels. Heavy wooden wheels on stone pavement, a grinding, rhythmic rumble that does not stop. It grows slightly louder, then passes, then there is the sound of another cart following behind it, and another behind that. These are the delivery carts, arriving now that the day is over, because during daylight hours the wheeled traffic of this enormous city was confined to the edges, the suburbs, the roads outside the gates. The streets inside were for people, but at night the carts come in. They have been waiting all afternoon outside the city boundaries, loaded with wine amphorae, with grain sacks, with timber, with oil, and now they pour through the gates and fill the dark streets with their sound. This is how Rome feeds and supplies itself in the dark, while most of its people are trying to sleep. The smell reaches you before anything else when you turn toward the more populated streets. It is a complex smell, not unpleasant exactly, but dense. There is wood smoke somewhere. There is olive oil, the particular warm, slightly fatty smell of oil burning in clay lamps, which comes from almost every inhabited window. There is the smell of the stone itself, old and chalky. Somewhere below, running beneath the street, you know the Cloaca Maxima drains toward the Tiber, the great sewer of Rome, and on a warm night, its presence is known to the nose, a faint subterranean reminder of the million lives being lived above it. Mixed into all of this is the smell of bread. Not yet, it is too early, but in a few hours, in the deep middle of the night, the bakers will already be awake, already feeding fuel to their stone ovens, and before dawn the smell of fresh bread will drift through these streets like the city's own dreaming. But that is hours away. For now, you stand in a street in Rome, in what is approximately the 100th year of the Common Era. The Emperor Trajan sits on the throne of the largest empire the world has yet seen. Beyond these walls, beyond the Tiber, beyond the hills, Roman roads stretch to Scotland in the north, to Mesopotamia in the east, to the sands of the Sahara in the south, to the Atlantic shores in the west. 5 million square kilometers, 60 or 70 million people, and all of it in some sense flows toward this city, which is fed and clothed and oiled and lit by what those roads carry. You are at the center of all of it. And yet what you see standing in this street is simply darkness, a lamp. A door, the sound of a cart, the smell of smoke and oil and old stone. Rome is not sleeping yet, but it is settling. It is becoming what it becomes every night, a different kind of city, not the loud, crowded world of the forum and the markets and the baths. This other version. The nighttime city which has its own rhythms, its own inhabitants, its own sounds and smells and movements, and which has been here every night for centuries. Let us walk through it together. Before we travel any further, if you are finding this peaceful, if this is helping you settle and rest, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed to the channel and left a like. It takes only a moment, and it helps this channel continue making these videos. And please write something in the comments. Tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you are. I am always genuinely curious. Write it in the comments when you have a moment. Now, let us continue. Chapter 1. A City That Never Fully Slept. The poet Juvenal, who lived and wrote in Rome during these very years, was not a man who enjoyed the nighttime city. In his satires, those sharp, sardonic poems about Roman life, he complained with real feeling about the sheer impossibility of sleeping in Rome. Wagons rumbling through the narrow streets, he wrote, and the noise of the cattlemen who would wake the dead. The city, as Juvenal experienced it, condemned its residents to everlasting insomnia. He was, of course, exaggerating for effect. That is what satirists do. But underneath the exaggeration, there was real experience, the experience of lying awake in a Roman apartment at night, listening to the carts. You have to understand something about this city to understand why the carts mattered so much. Rome, in the year 100 CE, is the largest city the Western world has ever known. Scholarly estimates place its population at somewhere around 1 million people, perhaps somewhat more, perhaps somewhat less, but in any case, a number that would not be matched again in Europe for nearly 1800 years. 1 million people crammed into the hills and valleys along the Tiber, living in buildings stacked 4, 5, and 6 stories high, packed into neighborhoods so dense that the streets between them were essentially channels, narrow passages where sunlight reached the ground only at midday. To feed this city, to supply it with wine and oil and grain and timber and cloth and everything else that a million lives required an enormous and constant movement of goods. And that movement, by law, could not happen during the day. The prohibition on wheeled traffic in Rome during daylight hours was one of the oldest pieces of urban management the Roman world had produced. The principle that the streets during the day belonged to pedestrians, not to carts, appears to have been in Julius Caesar's time, roughly a century and a half before the night you are imagining. By 100 CE, the custom was ancient, the habit deep. Merchants, bakers, builders, wine merchants, they all knew that their deliveries would arrive after dark. The carts would queue outside the gates, waiting for the last light to fade, and then they would come through, and the streets that had been thick with human bodies all day would fill instead with the grinding of wooden wheels over basalt cobblestones and the calls of the cart drivers and the occasional crash of a poorly secured amphora. This was Rome's nighttime economy, and it ran all night. For those trying to sleep above it, the sound was simply the texture of life. You did not escape it. You did not find silence. What you found, if you were lucky, was a kind of accommodation, the way the body learns over years to sleep through what it cannot avoid. The cart rumble becomes background, like the sound of the sea to those who live near the sea. It is always there. It is Rome. What Rome was not at night was dark in the way that a village or a forest is dark. The city had no public street lighting, no lamps installed by the city government to illuminate its roads, no systematic effort to push back the night. That came later in history, and Rome in its greatness never attempted it. And yet the city was not truly dark either. In every inhabited street, every occupied building, there was some light. A lamp in a window, a torch at a doorway, the coals of a brazier glowing orange through a crack in a shutter, the firelight of a still serving food. The city's darkness was a darkness punctuated by 1,000 small, warm, individual lights, and from above, from a hillside looking down into the valley of the circus, or across the ridge of the hill, Rome at night must have looked like a scatter of embers, not dark, not bright, but glowing. Under Trajan, the empire had reached what was perhaps its fullest extent. To the north, the legions had crossed the Danube and would soon complete the conquest of Dacia. To the east, campaigns were already being planned. The grain ships from Egypt and the wine ships from Spain arrived at Ostia and were offloaded onto smaller river barges that came up the Tiber to Rome's river docks, the Emporium, where slaves and freedmen unloaded them around the clock. The goods were then distributed through the city, often at night, through those narrow streets, on those wooden carts that Juvenal complained about with such feeling. This was the world you are in. Not the Rome of gladiators and emperors, though they are here too, somewhere in the city. Not the Rome of marble temples and triumphal processions. The night Rome, the working Rome, the Rome that does not appear in the official history because it was too ordinary, too constant, too much the background of everything else to be recorded. It was just life, and it was filled with sound. Think for a moment about what that means: 1 million people and no electric light. The comparison is almost impossible to make accurately, because there is no city of 1 million on the face of the earth today that operates without electrical illumination. What Rome had instead was fire. Every lamp was a small fire. Every torch was a fire. Every oven and brazier and hearth was a fire. Fire required someone to kindle it and someone to maintain it, and someone to purchase the oil or the wood or the charcoal that fed it. In Rome, the light of the evening was not free. It was bought, like food and water and everything else. A household that ran out of lamp oil in the evening sat in the dark. A household that could afford multiple lamps and good olive oil sat in something approaching warmth and comfort. Between those two conditions, darkness and light, lay the entire social spectrum of the city, rendered visible every evening as the sun went down, and the city began to determine, household by household, room by room, how much light it could afford. But you should not imagine the nighttime city as entirely somber. Rome was, among other things, a city that loved noise and company, and the social warmth of gathering in proximity to other people. The taverns and wine bars and fast food counters that lined the ground floors of the Insulae did not close when the sun set. Many of them opened more fully as the evening progressed, when the day workers had come home, and the carts had begun their rumble, and the evening meal was still ahead. The street, which in the afternoon had been a channel of purposeful human movement, merchants, slaves on errands, citizens heading to the baths, became in the evening something more social, more leisurely, more willing to linger. a city of 1,000,000 people, a city built on 7 hills and a river, full of smells and sounds and fire, full of people trying to sleep, and people trying to work, and people trying to eat and drink and be with one another. A city that had been here for 8 centuries and intended to be here for many centuries more. And in the middle of all of it, in the middle of all that noise and density and life, you are here too, listening, breathing, settling into the night. Chapter 2: The Insulae, living above the street. To sleep in Rome is, for most of its inhabitants, to sleep in an insula. The word means island, and in a sense, that is what these buildings were. Great solid masses of brick and concrete rising from the flow of the streets around them, their lower floors opening onto the city, their upper floors stacked above it, story after story, and lime mortar and timber, up to 5, and sometimes 6 stories into the Roman sky. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, had restricted their height to 70 Roman feet, roughly 20 meters, after fire and collapse disasters demonstrated what happened when builders pushed too high on inadequate foundations. But even at that regulated height, an insula was a significant structure. You are looking at it now from the street below. The building in front of you rises in stages. The ground floor, if this is a prosperous building, may house a row of workshops and shops with wide, gated openings that are shuttered now at night with wooden planks. Above those, the first floor proper, larger apartments, higher ceilings, access to the street by steps rather than ladders, rented to the wealthier end of the insula's population, merchants, skilled craftsmen, freed persons who have done well. Their windows are wide enough to let in light and air. By day, these rooms would feel almost spacious. Then you climb. The second floor is smaller. The rooms are narrower. The rents are lower. The third floor lower still. By the time you reach the 4th floor, and certainly the 5th, you are in territory that belongs to the of Rome's urban population, the day laborers who may not know tomorrow whether they will have work, the recent immigrants still finding their footing in the city's enormous and impersonal economy, the families of freed slaves living on the margin of subsistence. Their rooms are barely rooms, small chambers of rough-plastered wall and bare floor, with perhaps a single wooden shelf and a sleeping mat. Their windows, if they have windows, are small and high, cut to let some air in rather than to offer any view. The rent they pay is minimal, because what they are paying for is minimal, and what they receive in return beyond shelter is this: proximity. Proximity to the city's warmth, proximity to the food sellers and the water fountains, and proximity, whether they want it or not, to every other person on their floor, on the floor below, on the floor above. Insula walls were thin. The timber floors carried sound perfectly. You heard your neighbors through the walls, their arguments, their lovemaking, their coughing in the night, their prayers before their own small shrine, the particular heavy snoring of the man in the room next to yours. You heard the street below, which in the daytime was an unbroken human roar, and in the night was the grinding of carts and the calls of cart drivers. You heard the building itself, the settling of old timber, the groan of a beam, the drip of water somewhere in the walls. Privacy was not a concept that most Roman apartment dwellers could afford, and there was the fire. Most upper-floor apartments had no dedicated kitchen. They had no hearth, no chimney, no proper installation for cooking. What they had was a small portable brazier, or iron vessel that burned charcoal, and on which they could warm food or boil water or simply keep themselves warm in winter. This brazier lived in the same room where they slept, in the same room where they ate, in the same space where they did everything. It smoked. It consumed the oxygen in the room if the window was shut. It was a constant and significant fire hazard in a building whose floors and staircases were largely made of wood. The fear of fire in a Roman insula was not an abstract fear. It was a fact of life, the way weather is a fact of life, the way illness is a fact of life. Buildings burned. They burned regularly. They sometimes burned a whole neighborhood before the Vigiles could contain them. The record shows this. And for the people on the upper floors, the people who had chosen affordability over safety by climbing higher, the prospect of fire was most acute because the stairs were their only way down. If the fire began below, if the staircase was already burning when the alarm went up, the upper floors had no safe exit. You think of this, perhaps, as you lie on your sleeping mat on the 4th floor of an insula, listening to the cartwheels on the street below. You have lived here long enough that the thought is not new. It has worn itself into the texture of everyday awareness, the way any chronic uncertainty does present but not dominant, filed under the things you cannot change. What did the interior of one of these upper floor rooms actually look like? The archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum, along with the descriptions left by writers like N. Marshall, gives us some sense of it. The walls were plastered, a coat of lime plaster over the rough brick, sometimes painted in the bright reds and blacks that Roman decorators favored, more often simply whitewashed or left in the raw cream of the dry lime. The floor was stone or beaten earth, occasionally tiled in the better apartments. There was very little furniture, a bed or a sleeping mat, a wooden chest for clothing and valuables if you had them, a small shelf. The lamp occupied a particular spot on the shelf, not because anyone had designed the shelf for a lamp, but because you needed to put the lamp somewhere close enough to light the room without setting the shelf on fire. And the same spot was used every evening until it became the lamp's spot by habit and custom. The window, if there was one, was a small opening in the wall covered not with glass. Glass windows were an expensive rarity in this period, found in the most luxurious houses, but with wooden shutters, or with oiled cloth, or with thin sheets of mica or selenite stone that admitted some light while reducing the worst of the wind. In winter, the window was kept closed as much as possible. In summer, it was opened at night to let in whatever coolness the dark air offered. Heat was the great discomfort of the upper floors in summer, because the sun had warmed the roof and the upper walls all day, and that warmth stored itself in the stone and the brick and released slowly through the night. To sleep on the 5th floor of an insula in July was to sleep in warmth that the building itself generated, close, human warmth, without a breath of relief, until the pre-dawn hours when the stone had finally given back what it had absorbed. In winter, the reverse problem, the charcoal brazier in the corner, was the difference between tolerable cold and genuine suffering. A small or iron vessel, perhaps the size of a large cooking pot, filled with glowing charcoal that had been lit with great care, because you did not waste charcoal and could not easily relight it if it went out, and that burned with a dim orange glow through the hours of darkness. The heat it produced was modest, enough for one person sitting close to it. Enough to take the worst edge off the cold of the room. You wore your wool tunic to sleep. You pulled the blanket up. The brazier did the rest of what could be done. The coals in the brazier are low now, orange-red in the darkness. You watch them for a moment before you close your eyes. Somewhere in the building, a child is crying. On the floor below, a door opens and closes. The cart wheels grind on, steady and indifferent, as they will until morning. Chapter 3: The Vigiles, Watchmen of the Night. You hear them before you see them. The sound is unhurried but purposeful, boot leather on stone, a rhythmic pace, the occasional knock of a wooden bucket against a door frame or a wall. If you are lying near a window, you might hear, very faintly, the low exchange of two voices, not shouting, not alarmed, just the ordinary murmured conversation of men on a familiar route. Then the sound of a torch passing below the window, and through the crack in your shutter you see the brief orange flicker of its light across the plaster ceiling of your room. And then they are past. The sound fades. The street returns to cart rumble and the distant bark of a dog somewhere near the Tiber. The Vigiles have passed. They were not soldiers. You should understand that clearly. They were not the armored military men of the Roman legions, nor the Praetorian guards who served the emperor in his palace on the Palatine Hill. The Vigiles were something much more ordinary and in some ways more essential. A professional civil service, a standing force of working men whose job was to keep Rome from burning down and to keep the dark streets safe enough for the city to function. The Emperor Augustus had established them formally in the year 6 CE, in the aftermath of particularly destructive fires, because the previous arrangements for fire management, including, briefly, a force of 600 slaves organized under a private citizen, had proven inadequate to the scale of the city's needs. Augustus organized the Vigiles into 7 cohorts, each of approximately 1,000 men, for a total force of around 7,000. Each cohort was assigned responsibility for 2 of Rome's 14 administrative regions. They had permanent stations, their own officers, their own hierarchy, their own medical staff, 4 doctors assigned to each cohort, indicating that this was understood as a genuinely dangerous occupation. They were, in the way the Roman world organized itself, a profession. The equipment they carried on their patrols was practical rather than imposing. The leather bucket was the emblem of their trade, sealed with pitch to hold water, carried by a handle, designed for the rapid formation of human chains to pass water from one hand to the next when a fire had been located. It was from this bucket that they received their street nickname, the Little Bucket Men. The name had the quality of a joke told affectionately rather than cruelly, the sort of name a city gives to figures it sees every night, whose presence has become so familiar it can be gently teased. You knew the Vigiles. You probably recognized the men who patrolled your street. You knew what they looked like, how they moved, perhaps what their voices sounded like. They were not strangers. They were part of your night. For the more serious fires, the cohort could deploy a horse-drawn double-action water pump, partially submerged in a reservoir, capable of directing a continuous stream of water rather than depending entirely on bucket chains. This was sophisticated equipment, not primitive, not crude. The engineers of Rome had understood that fighting fire in a densely built city required something more than buckets, and the represented that understanding made metal and leather. But the Vigiles were not only firefighters. In the hours when no fire was burning, which on most nights was most of the night, they served as a night watch. They moved through the streets on patrol, discouraging the kind of opportunistic theft and assault that darkness encourages in any large city. They pursued runaway slaves, who in the Roman world were a category of person whose unauthorized movement through public space at night was a matter of legal concern. They dealt with disorder at the taverns, and when the wine had been too freely drunk and the evening's gambling had not ended in satisfaction. They were the human presence in the dark streets that reminded everyone that the city did not simply abandon itself after sunset. You can imagine lying in your fourth-floor room what the Vigiles meant to you as an ordinary Insula resident, not a government, not an authority in the abstract. A sound, a footstep, a torch flicker through the shutters. Evidence that the city was still watching, still maintaining itself, still doing the work of being a city even in its darkest hours. The sound of their patrol was, in its way, a kind of reassurance, not a guarantee, never a guarantee, but a presence. Something awake in the dark, doing its job while you tried to sleep. In the years before Augustus created them, before the professional Vigiles walked these streets, there had been the 3 magistrates who supervised a fire watch conducted by public slaves. The detail tells you something about how long Rome had known it needed a nighttime presence, how old the problem of fire in a dense city is, how many generations of Romans had lain awake in their apartments listening for the first smell of smoke. There was a texture to life in a city that was watched at night by known, familiar figures. The Vigiles were not an anonymous authority. They were people. They had names, presumably, known to the shopkeepers whose properties they checked, to the Insula residents who saw them pass every night. A man who lived on the Via Sacra, or near the circus, would over time come to recognize the particular gait of the pair who walked past his window at the same hour every night, the particular sound of the bucket they carried, the way their torch moved as they talked and walked simultaneously, the flame bending slightly with the motion of the man who held it. There was also, it should be said, a more pragmatic dimension to the Vigiles' presence. In a city as dense and as diverse as Rome, a city that contained immigrants from every corner of the empire, speakers of Greek and Aramaic and Berber and Gallic and Egyptian, people who had arrived with nothing and were trying to make something, the streets at night carried the normal human risk of opportunistic crime. The Vigiles' patrol was a deterrent not so much because it was military, but because it was present. You did not attack someone in an alley if you could hear boots on cobblestone approaching. You did not break into a warehouse if you knew the watch would pass in an hour. The presence itself was most of the protection. And their medical staff, the 4 doctors assigned to each cohort, tells us something else. That this was an organization that had thought about what it meant to send men into burning buildings and dark streets, and expected them to survive and recover. The doctors treated burns and wounds, yes, but also the other ailments of outdoor night labor, the cold illnesses of winter watch, the injuries from fires, and from the violent episodes that the night watch sometimes encountered. The Vigiles were not invincible. They were mortal, fallible, practical men doing a necessary job. The Vigiles' watch would continue until morning. All night, in regular rotation, the men of the cohort responsible for these 14 streets would walk their circuit. Their torches would flicker past your window again before dawn. the same footsteps, the same bucket knock, the same low conversation fading into the distance. Sleep a little more, they are out there. Chapter 4: Oil Lamps and the Evening Ritual. Before the household settled for the night, there was the lamp. In almost every Roman room where human life took place, in the atrium of a wealthy, in the small chamber of an insular apartment, in the cramped corner of where a craftsman ate his evening meal, there was an oil lamp. Most were made of the same reddish-brown clay from which Rome built much of itself. They were small objects, shaped to fit in the palm of a hand, a shallow reservoir for oil, a nozzle where the wick emerged, a hole at the top for filling. Some had a handle, a small loop of clay or metal. They were modest, practical, abundant. The oil that fueled them was olive oil, the fundamental fuel of the Mediterranean world, pressed from the olive groves of Italy, Spain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, arriving in Rome aboard the same ships and barges that brought wine and grain. The quality of the oil mattered. Rancid oil burned with more smoke and less light. A good oil burned cleaner and brighter. The wealthy could afford the better oil, which meant the wealthy had brighter, cleaner rooms in the evening. The poor used what they had. A single clay lamp in a small room gave you enough light to see shapes, to navigate, to make out the face of the person sitting opposite you, not much more. It was intimate light. It pulled the walls in close. Wealthier households did not limit themselves to a single clay lamp. They had lamps of bronze, cast and polished, with multiple nozzles so that several flames burned at once from a single vessel. They had candelabra, tall standing frames from which lamps or candles hung at different heights, which allowed the center of a room to be genuinely illuminated. A wealthy Roman dining room in the evening, lit by a bronze candelabrum and half a dozen oil lamps placed around the perimeter, would have been warm and golden, a genuinely pleasant light to eat and drink and converse by. Candles also existed. Made from tallow or beeswax, they were used in Rome, though they were generally considered less practical than oil lamps for domestic use, more expensive, less controllable, more likely to gutter and die in a draft. You see them more often in records of religious use, in sacred contexts, in the ceremonies of the temples. For the ordinary evening light of an ordinary Roman household, the clay oil lamp was what you used. What the lamp meant was more than illumination. It was a marker. When the lamp was lit in the evening, the day's public life was over. The streets and the forum and the baths and the markets were behind you. You were in the private world now, the domestic world, the small world of your own household. The lamp's circle of light was the boundary of that world, and everything within it, the faces of your family, the surfaces of the objects you owned, the shelf with its small painted figures, existed within a warmth that felt, in those hours, like the entirety of what mattered. There was also the smoke. Any flame in an enclosed space produces smoke, and a Roman room with a lamp or a brazier burning in it for several hours of an evening would have accumulated a kind of haze, not dangerous but present. The walls of many excavated Roman rooms, when examined closely, show traces of soot at ceiling height, the accumulated deposit of thousands of evenings of lamplight. The smell of a Roman interior in the evening was the smell of olive oil burning, faintly fatty, slightly sweet, warm. Mixed with the smoke from the brazier or the hearth, mixed with whatever food was being warmed or cooked, mixed with the smell of wool clothing and human bodies and the outdoor smells that had followed everyone in from the street. It was a dense human smell, a lived-in smell, the smell of Rome being Rome. The lamp burned lower as the evening progressed. The oil was consumed gradually, the flame diminishing slightly as the reservoir emptied. If you did not refill it, if the household had only the one lamp and the oil was carefully rationed, the light grew dimmer as the night deepened, the edges of the room retreating into shadow until only the table before you and the faces across it remained in the light. The world narrowed. The body began to want sleep. Think about what it meant for the Romans to end every evening this way, the light shrinking. Not switched off, not a sudden darkness, but a gradual dimming, a slow recession of the world's visible edges as the oil depleted. The room did not go dark all at once. It went dark the way evening goes dark, by degrees, the shadows deepening in the corners first, then at the walls, then closing in around the table, until what remained was a circle of warmth just large enough for the people who were still awake within it. The Roman evening ended not with a hard stop, but with a fade, the lamp measuring its own conclusion in oil consumed and flame diminished, until it was barely enough to see by, and then barely enough to know it was there, and then out. This quality of light, intimate, warm, shrinking, shaped the emotional texture of the Roman evening in ways that are difficult to reconstruct fully from the outside. It was, by the standards of what daylight offered, poor light. It was not good for reading, not consistently. It was not good for fine work that required detail. But it was good, in its way, for exactly what the evening required. Gathering, talking, eating together, being in close proximity to the people of your household. The edges of the room unimportant because the edges of the room were dark and you were not there, you were here, in the circle of the lamp, together. And before sleep, the household gathered one more time at the shrine. Chapter 5. The Prayers Before Sleep. In almost every Roman home, in the marble-floored atrium of a senator's, in the corner of a freedman's single room in an insula, in the narrow back of a bakery, there was a household shrine. It was often small, sometimes no more than a niche cut into the plastered wall and painted with figures, sometimes a more elaborate structure of wood or stone, resembling a small temple with tiny columns and a pitched roof, sometimes simply a shelf with a few clay statuettes arranged upon it. But small or large, elaborate or simple, it was a sacred place, the place where the household's relationship with its protecting spirits was made visible and maintained. The Lares were the guardian spirits of the household, ancient presences, older than Rome itself in their origins. They had been tending Roman homes since before memory. The household's own particular guardian was understood to belong to this house, to this family, to this line. It did not belong to a temple or a priest or an official religion. It belonged to you. It had always been here. When a Roman family moved into a new home, they brought there with them or acknowledged that was already present in the new space. The household's spiritual life moved with them or waited for them. It was intimate in a way that official Roman religion, the grand ceremonies at the Temple of Jupiter, the processions through the Forum, was not. Alongside lived the Penates, guardians of the pantry, the provisions, the household's food supply. In a world where hunger was never entirely abstract, where a bad harvest year could genuinely destabilize a household's survival, the Penates watched over something essential. They were honored along with the Lares at the household's daily rituals. The evening gathering at the was one of the anchors of the day. The family, or whatever portion of the household was present, which might include slaves who participated in the domestic religious life of their owners, gathered before the shrine. Food was offered, a portion set aside from the evening meal placed on the shelf before the painted figures or burned in a small dish of fire. Wine was poured. Incense might be burned, sending a thin coil of fragrant smoke upward toward the painted ceiling. There were words spoken, prayers, gratitude, requests for the night's protection. The language was personal, not liturgical. You did not need a priest. You needed only to be present and to intend what you were doing. There is something in this ritual that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Romans were not, in their domestic religion, calling out to distant and enormous cosmic forces. The Lares were close. They were specific. They were the guardians of this hearth, this threshold, this particular household in this particular street in this city. When you prayed to them in the evening, you were not performing a duty toward an abstract deity. You were addressing something that was in some sense yours, that had chosen you, or that you had inherited, or that you had created by living here long enough and attending to the obligations of the household carefully enough. The flame of the household hearth, even in apartments where the hearth was only a small clay brazier, carried a resonance that connected outward. Scholars have noted that the Romans understood the Vestal Virgin's sacred flame in the Forum, the eternal fire tended in the Temple of Vesta, which was never allowed to go out, as spiritually connected to the individual household flames of every Roman family. The city's fire and the family's fire were not the same, but they partook of the same principle. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and every hearth in Rome was, in some sense, her domain. This is how the Romans experienced it, not as a theological proposition, but as a felt reality, that the lamp in the corner and the undying flame in the temple were parts of the same sacred thing. Now the prayers are done. The shrine is tended. The last wisp of incense smoke rises and disperses in the warm air of the room. One by one, the members of the household settle for the night, moving to their sleeping spaces, pulling their blankets around them, letting the weight of the day come to rest. The lamp burns low on the shelf beside the, casting its small orange circle on the painted figures of the Lares, who stand in their ancient attitudes with their arms raised in blessing or protection. The image of them, lit by the lamp's fading glow, is the last thing you see before you close your eyes. They are watching over the household now. The threshold is protected. The pantry is in the keeping of the Penates. The stands at his post in the painted niche where he has always stood. You are home, you are held, you can sleep. Chapter 6. Thee and the Night Market. Not everyone was heading to bed. Down in the street, and you can hear it, if your window is open even slightly, if the shutter is not fully drawn, the night is alive with commerce. The on the corner of the street has been open since mid-afternoon and will remain open for several more hours yet. Its light spills through the doorway onto the pavement outside. The warm, unsteady flicker of oil lamps and the glow from the coals kept burning beneath the stone counter. If you descended the stairs right now and walked to the corner, you would find it crowded. There is a small place, most are. A stone counter faced with slabs of marble or polished limestone, deeply cut with round holes into which large ceramic jars. They are set flush, their contents kept warm by the coals below. Along the front of the counter, in the dim light, you can see the things for sale: cooked lentils in one jar, seasoned with cumin and a little, the fermented fish sauce that flavors so much of Roman cooking. Beans in another, thick and softened from hours of slow heating. Perhaps a porridge of emmer wheat. Hot water mixed with wine, which a Roman man or woman after a long day's work wanted more than almost anything. Something warm, something slightly intoxicating, served in a clay cup that you hold in both hands while the warmth passes through the pottery into your palms. The evidence from Pompeii gives us our clearest picture of what these places looked like. Because Pompeii was frozen in the midst of ordinary life when Vesuvius buried it in 79 CE, less than a generation before the night you are imagining. Archaeologists have excavated more than 80 in Pompeii alone, 80 fast food counters scattered through that one city, which was not even very large compared to Rome itself. In Rome, there were certainly hundreds, perhaps more, serving the enormous population of people who lived in apartments without kitchens and could not cook for themselves. This is the reality of life in an insula. You cannot roast a joint of meat on your fourth-floor charcoal brazier. You cannot bake bread. You cannot do the kind of sustained, fuel-hungry cooking that produces a serious meal. What you can do is go downstairs to thee and spend a few copper coins on something warm. And so every evening, the fills with exactly the people from the Insulae above. The freedman coming home from his workshop, the woman who has spent the day selling goods in the market, the laborer whose arms are heavy from the docks, the young man who arrived from somewhere in the provinces 6 months ago and is still figuring out how this enormous city works. They eat standing, usually. The counter is the eating surface, the street is the dining room. Or they sit on the low benches outside the door, cups in hand, and watch the street. Because the street at night is worth watching. The carts are rumbling past. The Vigiles have just gone by, their torch bobbing, their bucket clanking. A group of men emerges from the 2 doors down, loud with wine, arguing about something, a chariot race, perhaps, or a dice game that did not go the way someone had hoped. Juvenal would recognize every one of these people. He wrote about them, the drunks lurching home, the gamblers spilling out of the wine bars, the dropped jar that shatters on the pavement with a sound like a small thunder clap, and someone curses and someone else laughs. Juvenal found it maddening, but it is also in its way simply a city being a city, people living, people eating and drinking and arguing and going home. In that line, the ground floor of the Insulae, other transactions are still ongoing. The fuller, who treats and cleans wool cloth, may still have men working by lamplight. The metalworker's workshop glows. A doctor has a lamp burning because illness does not keep daylight hours. A scribe takes dictation for a letter. The ground floor world does not go dark all at once. It fades gradually as the night deepens, one lamp extinguished here, one shutter drawn there, until by the middle of the night, only the and the most determined wine bars are still lit and still occupied. The cart traffic reaches its peak in the middle of the night. The deliveries that have been waiting outside the city gates since late afternoon are now fully inside the walls, filling the streets with their loads. Grain from the emporium warehouses is being moved inland to the bakeries. Wine amphorae from the river docks are being distributed to the and timber, stone, building materials. Construction in Rome never really stopped during this period of enormous civic expansion, are being moved to work sites before the day workers arrived in the morning. The city is resupplied in the dark by men and animals you will never see from your window. The is beginning to thin out now. The last cups have been drunk. The coals beneath the counter are still warm but no longer actively tended. The proprietor is wiping the counter with a damp cloth, not because the night is over, but because there is a rhythm to it, a slow closing down, a gradual reduction of the lamp wicks, a quieting of the space that happens not all at once, but piece by piece. In an hour or perhaps two, the counter will be cold. The shutters will be drawn. The glow from the doorway will be gone. For now, it is still there, warm, lit, serving. Come in out of the dark if you want to. The life of the night market extended beyond the fixed. Street vendors moved through the city's arteries even in the dark hours, men carrying baskets of food or clay cups of wine, calling out their wares in voices that became, after a while, just another layer of the night's sound. The sellers of sausages, of roasted chickpeas, of sweet things made with honey, they moved to where the people were, which in the evening meant the tavern doorways and the corners where the cart drivers rested their animals, and the spots near the public fountains where water was available. Commerce in Rome did not require a fixed address. It required only that someone had something to sell and someone else had a small coin to spend on it. The gambling that Juvenal complained about with such asperity was a genuine feature of the Roman evening. Dice games were played in the wine bars and on the streets outside them by men who found in the uncertainty of a thrown die an excitement that the long monotony of physical labor did not provide. Some of this gambling was small and social. A few coins on the table, a game between friends, nobody's ruin. Some of it was more serious, and the losers who stumbled out into the night with less than they had arrived with were, Juvenal insisted, precisely the sort of people who then made the streets of Rome interesting for all the wrong reasons. He was, again, being acidic, but the gambling was real, the wine was real, the noise was real, and under and through all of this, the carts were real. They did not pause for the gambling or the arguments or the food vendors or the vigils or any of the other activities of the Roman night. They kept their own rhythm, which was the rhythm of commerce and supply, the rhythm of a city that was always hungry, that required feeding continuously, that had 11 aqueducts running into it and a dozen sea routes carrying grain to it and roads from every direction bringing everything else. The carts were the city's bloodstream, and at night they ran without ceasing. You can hear them even now if you sit quietly enough. Somewhere in the distance, the low, steady grind of wheels on stone, the city's pulse, Rome resupplying itself in the dark. Chapter 7. Sleeping in Rome, from slave to senator. To sleep in Rome is to sleep in one of perhaps a dozen different ways, depending entirely on where in the city's enormous and sharply graded social structure you find yourself. Let us begin at the top. On the Palatine Hill, in the great houses that cascade down its slopes and spread across its summit. Some of them the residences of the most powerful men in the empire, the senators, the generals, the wealthy equestrians, the imperial family themselves. The experience of night is something quite different from what the Insula resident knows. The private house of the Roman wealthy is organized around an open courtyard, the atrium, and beyond it a garden, the peristyle, and arranged around these central spaces are the rooms of the household. The bedroom, in a wealthy, that was designed specifically for sleep. Not large, Roman rooms were generally not large, even wealthy ones, because the climate of Italy made smaller spaces easier to manage in both heat and cold, but private. Properly private, with thick walls and a door and perhaps a heavy curtain across the entrance. The bed was a frame of metal or fine hardwood, supported on 4 legs, with a base of interlaced leather straps or woven cords that formed a flexible sleeping surface. Over this, a mattress stuffed, in the wealthier houses, with feathers, which had become fashionable for the Roman elite by the late Republic, or wool, or the aromatic herbs that some believed aided sleep. Over the mattress, linen sheets in summer, wool blankets in the cooler months. A pillow, perhaps of stuffed wool or linen. The wealthy Roman might have 2, a room designated for the afternoon nap, and a separate room for night sleep. The night room might be positioned in the house to face a particular direction, to catch the morning light or to stay cool in the summer heat. These were practical arrangements, and they indicate a relationship with sleep that had been thought about, planned for, organized. Sleep for the wealthy Roman was something to be managed and optimized, not simply something that happened when you lay down. Now come down. Down from the Palatine Hill, through the wealthier ground floors of the better Insulae, past the 2nd floor and the 3rd, up to the 4th and the 5th, where the rents are cheapest and the rooms are smallest. The person sleeping here has a bed, very likely, a simple wooden frame with a base of wool cord or rope, a mattress of hay or straw compressed into a rough envelope of coarse cloth, perhaps a blanket of undyed wool, thick enough to be warm but heavy enough to feel the weight of it across the body. The room itself is what you have already seen, small, a single window high in the wall, the charcoal brazier in the corner still holding its last warmth, a shelf, a few personal objects. This is not poverty, exactly, it is ordinariness. Most of the people in Rome slept in rooms like this, on beds like this, under blankets like this. The bed kept you off the cold stone floor, which was its essential function. The blanket kept you warm. The room kept the wind out. The lamp, now extinguished, had illuminated the evening's last few hours. What more is required? The body does not demand comfort in order to sleep. It demands safety and warmth, and in their modest way, these rooms provided both. And then there are those who have neither bed nor room. The slaves of Rome, and at this period in the city's history, Rome was a slave-owning society in which human property was an unremarkable feature of daily life across most social classes, slept where they were put or where they found space. In a wealthy household, a slave might sleep on a pallet in the corridor outside the master's, available to be called at any hour of the night. In a bakery, slaves worked through the night and slept during the day when they slept at all. In an insula, the urban slaves of a moderately prosperous family might sleep in the kitchen corner on a pile of straw with a single blanket. They had no right to a designated sleeping space. They slept where the household's needs permitted them to sleep. The material reality of this is stark, and it is worth holding in mind as we move through the Roman night, that for a substantial portion of the population of Rome, the basic comfort of a private sleeping space, a room that belonged to them, with a door that closed, in which they were not subject to interruption or demand, was simply not available. The night that was, for the senator, an organized retreat into planned comfort and privacy, was, for the slave in the corridor, a cramped rest on hard stone that might be ended at any moment by a footstep and a word. There is something else to say about how Romans slept, something that scholars have found evidence for in the ancient texts, and which changes how you think about the Roman night. Some historians of sleep and medicine, including those who have analyzed the university research on Roman sleep patterns and the notes compiled by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, have suggested that Romans may have practiced what is now called segmented or biphasic sleep, a pattern in which the night's rest was divided into two distinct periods, separated by a waking interval of roughly an hour or so. The idea is this: a Roman might fall asleep shortly after dark and sleep for 3 or 4 hours, the first sleep, then wake naturally in the deep middle of the night, lie awake for a while in the dark, and then return to sleep for the second period until morning. This is presented carefully because it remains a subject of scholarly discussion rather than settled fact. The evidence comes partly from references in ancient texts, in Virgil, in Juvenal, in medical writers, where the structure of a night is sometimes described in terms that seem consistent with this pattern, where references to the first sleep and the middle of the night imply an expectation of waking rather than 8 unbroken hours of unconsciousness. But ancient writers were not writing sleep studies, and interpretation requires care. What we can say is this: if such a pattern did exist, it would make sense in the context of Rome at night. The middle of the night waking would coincide with the hours of deepest darkness and deepest cart noise, a period when the streets were loudest, when the city's resupply operation was at its most active, when the various sounds of a million people's nighttime existence were woven together into a dense and continuous urban texture that was not conducive to uninterrupted sleep. What did Romans do in that waking interval, if it existed? Ancient references suggest various things: prayer again a little reading or writing by lamplight, if you were literate and could afford the lamp oil, quiet conversation with whoever else happened to be awake. Some physicians of the period recommended using the waking interval for meditation, for composing one's thoughts, for the sort of internal calm that the daylight hours, with their demands and noise, did not permit. It is an image worth sitting with: a Roman awake in the deep middle of the night, lying on their bed in a room lit by a single low lamp, while the city outside makes its continuous noise. Not anxious, not sleepless in the troubled sense, simply awake in the way the night sometimes brings you to wakefulness, rested enough to think, not yet ready for the day, suspended in the hour between one sleep and the next. The wealthy Roman who had access to books and writing materials might, if the researchers are correct in their interpretation of the ancient texts, use this interval for private reading or composition. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist who died at Pompeii watching the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, was famous for his extraordinary work ethic and his refusal to let any hour of the day or night go unused for study. He was read to while he bathed, while he ate, while he traveled in his litter. Whether the waking interval of the night was part of this continuous intellectual engagement We cannot say with certainty. But the culture that produced Pliny had an orientation toward those nighttime hours as potential rather than merely as inconvenience. For the less wealthy sleeper, for the freedman in the insula, for the day laborer who needed his body recovered for the morning's work, the waking interval, if it came, was perhaps more simply a time of lying in the dark and being present in the night, not reading, not writing, simply being awake and aware in the particular stillness of the city's quietest hours. There is a quality to this kind of wakeful rest that those who have experienced it in their own lives may recognize, a softness of mind, a looseness of thought, that is neither the alert consciousness of the day nor the total absence of sleep, something between, the body resting even as the mind drifts. The cart wheels turn, the torch of the vigils passes, the coals in the brazier have gone out, and the room is cooler now, and the blanket is pulled up. The lamp flame bends in some small draught from the window. Somewhere below, the city is still feeding itself, still moving, still doing the work that the day does not permit. And you are awake, briefly, in the middle of it, present in the Roman night. Chapter 8: The Waking Hour. There is a particular stillness that belongs to this hour. Not silence, you already know that Rome is never silent, but a stillness underneath the sound. The carts have been running for hours now, and the mind has ceased to register them individually. The arguing voices from the wine bar 2 streets over have gone quiet. The child on the floor below has long since stopped crying. Even the on the corner has extinguished its lamps and drawn its shutters. The city has not stopped. But its loudness has shifted into something more uniform, more constant, a kind of white noise made of wheels and wind and the faint movement of the Tiber in its banks not far away. If you are the Roman who has woken in this interval, who has surfaced from the first sleep into this middle-hour consciousness, you lie quite still and let it happen. There is no alarm. There is no urgency. This is simply the night doing what the night does. The room is very dark. The lamp has burned out, or you extinguished it before sleeping, and the only light comes from the thin line of sky visible through the high window slit. A strip of deep blue-black in which, if you look at it long enough, you can see a star or two moving with the slow turning of the heavens. The coals in the brazier are cold. The blanket is warm. The body is rested, the first sleep having done its work, and the mind is soft and unhurried in a way that the evening's hours, with their lamp and their meal and their prayers that did not allow. You might pray. The gesture is small, a quiet address to the not a formal ritual but a simple acknowledgement. Something is awake with you in the darkness. Something notices that you are here. You might think about tomorrow, what work there is, what needs attending, the person you were supposed to see. But these thoughts drift rather than pressing. The middle of the night is not the time for decisions. It is the time for thoughts to pass through without being caught. You might simply lie still and listen to Rome. The cart wheels, the occasional shout of a driver, the creak of timber in the building settling around you, the breathing of the person sleeping beside you if you share this small room with someone, a spouse, a child, another member of the household. Breathing has a way of becoming noticeable in the deep middle of the night. The simple fact of it, the body beside you, alive and warm and entirely unconscious, rising and falling in its own slow rhythm. It is steadying that sound. It is evidence that the night is ordinary, that nothing is wrong, that the world is continuing in its usual way while you lie here in the dark being temporarily awake. There is nothing to do, nothing is required. The second sleep will come. It always does. The mind that was briefly active will soften again, the thoughts will thin and separate. The heaviness will return, not unwelcome, but welcome, the body drawing itself back down toward unconsciousness. It is like sinking. It is like the slow descent into warm water. The city continues its noise outside the window. The star in the high slit of window has moved slightly, imperceptibly, the way stars move when you watch them long enough. The sky beyond it is the same deep black it was an hour ago. Dawn is still far. Close your eyes. There is nothing to do but sleep. Chapter 9. The Bakers and the Before-Dawn World. In a street near the hill, or near or any of the other hills where Rome's working neighborhoods clustered, there is a bakery that has not been silent for a single hour of this night. The bakery in Rome was not quite what the word suggests to us now. It was a combined operation. The baker was also the miller, because there were no separate public mills for the city's bread. The grain came in from the warehouses, from the enormous, on the banks of the Tiber that stored grain from Egypt and North Africa, and it was ground on site in the bakery itself, before it became flour, before it became dough, before it became the flat, dense loaves that were a staple of Roman diet for people of every class. The mills were made of stone. 2 large volcanic stones, the lower one fixed, and the upper one, the meta, rotating around it on a wooden axle. The upper stone had a wide double opening through which grain was fed from above, and as it turned, the grain was crushed between the stones and emerged as flour at the base. The sound of this process was a heavy, rhythmic grinding, stone on stone, grain on stone, a deep, regular sound that in the deep night could be heard from the street outside. It was a sound that required tremendous continuous labor to produce. In Rome, the work of turning the mills was generally assigned to slaves. And not simply to any slaves, mill work was one of the most physically demanding and spirit-crushing assignments available in the Roman economy. It was hard labor of a grinding, repetitive kind, performed in a space thick with flour dust, in darkness and heat, without end. Writers of the period note that mill work was used as a punishment, that a slave who had committed some offense might be threatened with reassignment to the mill as a form of degradation and suffering. It was understood, without ambiguity, as one of the worst fates within the Roman system of bound labor. And yet in this bakery, in the deep middle of the night, the mills are turning. The men, slaves, very likely, or freedmen who have no better option, are at the wooden handles, pushing them in circles, the stone grinding, the flour accumulating in the wooden trough at the base, the air white with dust in the lamplight. They have been doing this for hours. They will continue doing it until enough flour has been produced for the day's baking. The ovens are already lit, not blazing yet. This is still the middle of the night, but the fuel has been loaded and the fire has been set, and the interior of the stone bread oven is beginning its long, slow rise toward baking temperature. This process cannot be hurried. The thermal mass of the stone needs time to absorb the heat, to become uniform in its warmth, before dough can be placed inside with any expectation of an even bake. A baker who did not understand this would produce bread that was burned on the outside and raw at the center. A baker who understood it, who had been doing this for years, who knew the particular personality of their own oven, would load the fire at precisely the right hour to have the baking temperature ready by a certain time. That time for a Roman baker was shortly before dawn. Bread was the central food of Rome. The grain dole, the public distribution of grain to Rome's citizens, had been a feature of Roman civic life for generations by this point, and under Trajan it provided grain to a very large portion of the city's population. But grain needed to become bread, and bread needed to be fresh, and freshness meant morning. The bakeries of Rome produced fresh bread at dawn, and the early morning market for that bread was brisk. By the time the first light began to appear over the hills to the east, the first loaves needed to be out of the oven and cooling on the wooden racks, ready for the vendors and the residents who would come for them. To achieve this, the bakers began their work not at dawn, but well before it, in the deepest dark of the night, hours before any light. The mills grinding, the ovens heating, the dough being mixed and portioned and shaped on long stone tables. The bakery was warm, which in the winter was a mercy, and in the summer was a particular trial. The flour dust was constant. The firelight from the oven door cast everything in orange and shadow. The bread itself was dense and substantial, Roman bread made from emmer wheat or spelt, leavened with a sourdough starter that was kept alive and fed daily, formed into round loaves with a scored top, baked directly on the stone floor of the oven or on ceramic forms. In Pompeii, archaeologists found actual carbonized loaves still on the racks in a bakery that had been buried in 79 CE, round, heavy, scored in 8 wedge-shaped segments, exactly the size of what you could carry under one arm from a bakery counter. The evidence from those loaves suggests the bread was good, well-risen, properly baked, the kind of bread that constitutes a real meal when torn apart and eaten with a little olive oil and some salted cheese. Bread of this quality required time and skill, and above all the right temperature in the oven, and the right temperature in the oven required the unhurried pre-dawn labor of the bakery's workers. There were no shortcuts. You could not rush the stone to heat. You could not force the dough to rise faster than the yeast, and the flour and the warmth conspired to make it. The baker's schedule was set by the physics of fire and stone and grain, and the baker arranged his nights around it, generation after generation, with the particular resignation of those whose work is governed by necessities that do not negotiate. Outside the bakery, the street was quiet in the particular way of the deep night hours, not silent, but with the deep night texture of cart noise and the distant sounds of a city that does not sleep. But in the bakery, there was a different kind of industry, focused, physical, timed. This was not the frantic energy of a busy day. This was the methodical, repetitive, practiced work of people who did this every night, who had learned to perform it in a kind of working sleep, their bodies going through the familiar motions while their minds were somewhere else. Other night workers moved through Rome's streets during these hours. Water carriers, moving from the public fountains, fed continuously by the 11 major aqueducts that supplied the city, a system that Strabo had famously compared to rivers flowing through the city, carrying water to households that needed it before the day began. Freedmen running messages or errands for wealthy households whose business could not wait for daylight. The teams of slaves who maintained the city's infrastructure, cleaning the aqueduct channels, tending the public latrines, doing the invisible maintenance work that kept a city of 1 million people functional. The city's water, delivered by those 11 aqueducts in such quantities that public fountains ran without ceasing, was a kind of miracle of engineering that the Romans themselves recognized as extraordinary. The fountains that stood at intervals through the neighborhoods, the free drinking water of the Roman city, available to anyone, flowed through the night as they flowed through the day, their sound a constant soft presence in the streets. In the deep stillness between cart passages, if you were out in the street, you could hear it. The gentle overflow of the public fountain, the water running from its lip into the channel at its base and away down the gutter. The public fountains of Rome, as they were called, the small basins that stood at intervals through every neighborhood, were fed by the aqueduct's overflow, running continuously day and night, the water splashing from the outlet pipe into the basin with a quiet, steady sound that became, over the years of living near one, simply the sound of the neighborhood. The water carriers who moved through the streets before dawn, filling their amphorae and wooden buckets from these fountains, and carrying them up to apartments whose residents had paid for water delivery, moved through the pre-dawn streets in a kind of underwater quiet. The splash of the fountain, the creak of a loaded shoulder yoke, the soft sound of water shifting in a sealed vessel. They were among the first people fully awake in the city every day, their work beginning when most of the city was still in its second sleep. There were others. A doctor's lamp might be burning in the night, because illness does not schedule itself around daylight. A moneylender might have a candle lit for a late transaction, because money has its own hours. A scribe, hired to copy documents, might work through the quiet pre-dawn hours when no client would come to interrupt. The city had its particular population of night workers, people whose commerce or service or necessity placed them among the few waking figures in the dark streets, while the majority of Rome's millions slept. Rome was feeding itself. Rome was watering itself. Rome was preparing, in the dark, for the day that was still hours away. And in the bakery on the first loaves were going into the oven. Chapter 10. The Tiber at Night. If you left the Insulae behind and walked west through the dark streets toward the river, the city would gradually open up around you. The buildings thinned, the streets widened slightly, the smell changed, less smoke and oil, more water and mud, and the particular damp cold that the river produces even in summer, a coolness rising from the water like a breath. The Tiber in this period was a working river above all else. Its banks at the Emporium, the great warehouse district below the hill, were lined with the enormous storage buildings where grain and oil and wine were held before distribution through the city. Barges worked these docks constantly, bringing goods up from Ostia, Rome's port at the river mouth, where the ocean-going cargo ships offloaded onto the smaller river craft. At night, the dock workers who had been unloading through the evening were giving way to the carters who would move the goods into the city streets. The river itself, in these night hours, was a dark and slow-moving presence. Not fast here in its lower reaches, the Tiber is a meandering river by nature, and through Rome it flowed in broad curves, its surface dark and quiet except where the dock torches or the lights of the ponds, the ancient stone bridge, cast their reflections on the water. The reflections moved, broken by the current, reformed, broken again, a slow and restless light on the dark water. The Tiber flooded. This was not an occasional disaster, but a regular feature of Roman life. The river could rise several meters above its normal level during flood season, inundating the lower-lying neighborhoods, the Forum, with silt-brown water. The records show that this happened often enough to be anticipated, to have become part of the rhythms of the city, another thing you adapted to rather than solved. After the flood, the mud. After the mud, the cleaning. The city went on. Below your feet, as you stand on the embankment, the Cloaca Maxima runs through the dark, the great sewer of Rome, one of the most ancient of the city's engineering works, its arched brick tunnels carrying the effluent of the city toward the river. On warm nights, and this night is not quite cool, there is a faint reminder of its presence, something in the air, earthen and organic, that mixes with the smell of river water and mud and the distant char of the bakers' ovens. Rome's smells were complicated. They were the smells of a city that had no division between its beauty and its function. The temple and the sewer were in the same city, often on the same street, their smells mingling in the same air. The river moved slowly. A night bird called from somewhere along the far bank, where the walls of the city extended across and trees grew in the dark beyond them. The sound was brief and then gone. The water lapped at the base of the embankment stones with a quiet, patient sound. You stood at the river's edge for a moment, and the city was behind you, its noise muffled, its lights distant, and ahead was the darkness of the river and the darkness of the other bank and the darkness of the sky above the far hills. It was the widest view available to you in Rome, the most open space, the place where the city's density relaxed slightly and let you breathe. The stars were visible here, away from the densest concentration of lamplit streets. More of them brighter, closer seeming above the open water. You could see the Wain, what we would call the Big Dipper, hanging in the northern sky, its two-pointer stars aimed at the steady bright point of Polaris, the North Star. Sailors used this. Travelers used this. In the Great Plains to the north of the Empire, in the deserts to the south and east, men navigating at night looked for exactly this, the fixed point while everything else turned around it. The far bank, the neighborhood beyond the Tiber, later called, was quieter than the city proper in these night hours, its streets even narrower, its population a dense mix of freedmen and artisans, and the large Jewish community that had lived in Rome for generations. Across the dark water, you could see a lamp or two in a window. Otherwise, it was simply a dark rise of buildings against the sky. The boats were tied up for the night at the docks below the flat-bottomed river barges that spent their days moving grain and goods up from Ostia, moored now in rows along the bank, their hulls rocking gently in the slow current. The ropes that held them to the iron rings in the embankment stone creaked with a low, rhythmic sound, and occasionally a barge shifted and bumped softly against its neighbor, and then settled again. The river smelled of mud and cold water, and faintly, the particular mineral smell of the stone embankment that had been wet and dried and wet again across many centuries. There was a kind of peace here that the insular streets did not offer. Not silence, the cart noise was still audible from a few streets back, but openness. The sky above the river was the widest sky available anywhere in the city, unobstructed by rooflines or upper-story walls. On a clear night, as this one appears to be, the stars above the Tiber were brilliant, their reflections broken but persistent in the moving water below, small wavering points of light in the dark river. The sky repeated in the water repeated in the sky. The Tiber moved past in the dark. The city breathed behind you. Chapter 11. Stars over Rome. Stand still and look up. The sky above Rome in these years was darker than any city sky you are likely to have seen in your own life. There was no manufactured light to push the stars back. The oil lamps and the torches and the brazier coals, all the small fires of a million lives, did not amount to the kind of pervasive glow that the modern world produces. What they produced instead was a city that glowed in its valleys and along its hills in scattered warm points, and above that glow, the full sky of the ancient world undimmed. The Romans named the 7 bodies they could see with the naked eye. The sun and the moon they had always had. The 5 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, were each understood as a deity, each associated with particular powers and domains. Jupiter, the king of gods, ruled the largest and slowest moving object in the sky. Mars, the god of war, gave his red cast to the planet that bore his name. Venus, brilliant in the west after sunset or in the east before dawn, was the most beautiful and the most conspicuous. Mercury moved fastest among them, tracking close to the sun, sometimes visible only briefly before the light drowned it. Saturn moved most slowly of all, its path through the constellations taking years to complete, grave and stately. Astrology, the reading of human fate through the positions and movements of these bodies, was not a fringe activity in Rome. It was taken seriously by educated people, by senators, by emperors. It was a legitimate field of knowledge, as had presented it in his poem, written during the reign of Augustus, and as later scholars continued to elaborate. A child born on a particular night, with a particular constellation rising in the east and Mars in a particular house of the sky, had a character and a fate that the stars had already indicated. You did not dismiss this. It was woven into how the educated Romans understood the cosmos, and yet the sky was also practical. The Pleiades, the small cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, were a farmer's calendar. When they rose with the sun in spring, it was time to plant. When they set in the autumn evening sky, the harvest should be complete. Arcturus, the bright orange star in the constellation, was a storm warning. When it rose above the horizon, sailors and farmers paid attention because bad weather tended to follow. Polaris, the North Star, was a compass. These were tools, as real and as useful as an iron plow or a leather-sealed bucket. The 12 constellations of the zodiac traced a great belt across the sky, the path along which the sun, moon, and planets moved through the year. Every educated Roman would have known these 12: Aries and Taurus and Gemini, Cancer and Leo and Virgo, Libra and Scorpio and Sagittarius, Capricornus and Aquarius and Pisces. They were not merely astronomical features. They were characters, presences, each with its own mythology and its own influence. A man who knew which sign was rising when he was born, and which planet was crossing which constellation at the moment of some important decision, was a man who had access to information that the gods themselves had written in the sky. The Romans had inherited all this from the Greeks, who had inherited it from the Babylonians, who who had been reading the stars for thousands of years before Rome was founded. The constellations that a Roman shepherd recognized on the hillside above his flock were the same constellations his counterpart in Mesopotamia had named centuries earlier, though the stories he told about them were shaped by different gods, different heroes, different sacred landscapes. From a rooftop in Rome, from one of the high terraces of an insula, or from the slope of the Palatine, where some of the wealthiest houses had gardens with views across the valley, the sky was everything. The city below was noise and smell and heat, and the small warm lights of a million lives. The sky above was immense and silent and turning, as it had turned since before any human being had put down a wall and called it home. There are plans being laid, in these years around 100 CE, for a building that will become one of the most remarkable structures in the history of Rome and in the history of architecture. On the campus, the flat plain between the city's hills and the bend of the Tiber, the ground is being prepared for what will eventually become the Pantheon, the temple to all the gods, rebuilt and transformed under the Emperor Hadrian, who will begin his reign in 117 CE. The dome that Hadrian's architects will complete, a perfect hemisphere of concrete 43 meters in diameter, will have at its apex a circular opening, the oculus, a perfect eye of sky looking down into the building and looking up into it from the building, so that on clear nights the stars themselves will be visible from inside the temple, framed by that perfect circle of concrete. Rain falls through it. The sun's disk moves across the interior walls as the day turns. That building is not yet finished, but it will be in the generation to come, and it will be Rome's most permanent statement about its relationship to the sky, that the sky should be brought inside, made intimate, made sacred in stone and concrete, so that you could stand within a human building and still look up and see the cosmos turning above you. For now, the stars are simply there. The same stars that shine over Rome tonight shine over every soldier on every frontier, over every slave in every provincial farmhouse, over every sailor making the crossing from Carthage to Ostia, over every shepherd sleeping beside his flock on a Macedonian hillside. The sky is the one thing that belongs to everyone and is from no one. The emperor in his Palatine palace and the insular tenant on his straw mattress sleep under the same stars. It is an equalizer of a kind. Not of condition, not of comfort, not of freedom, but of sky. Chapter 12. Closing, the city breathes. The sky to the east is not yet light. Not yet, but something has shifted in the quality of the darkness, something difficult to name but real. The deep blue-black of the night's middle has softened, fractionally, into something that is not quite dark in quite the same way. If you looked very carefully at the horizon above the hill, above the rooftops and the chimneys and the high upper stories of the Insulae, you might see, or think you see, the barest trace of a paleness at the very edge of the sky. Rome is still mostly sleeping. The carts are still running. They will run until the first proper light, when the daytime ban on wheels reasserts itself and the city's pulse shifts back from the wheeled commerce of the night to the human pedestrian commerce of the day. But the night's deepest, loudest hours have passed. The on the corner has been dark for hours. The last wine bar argument has long since exhausted itself. The sound of the city has thinned, not into silence, never silence, but into something more spare, more open, with more space between the sounds. In the bakery near the first loaves are already out of the oven. They are cooling on wooden racks in the warm air of the bakery, the dark, crusted top of each round loaf, the scored surface that lets the steam escape, the particular smell of fresh bread that is unlike almost anything else in the world. The baker is already preparing the second batch. By the time the first customers arrive at the doorway, an hour or two from now, the racks will be full and the oven will be working steadily, and the smell of that bread will drift through the surrounding streets like the morning itself, before the morning has properly arrived. Somewhere in the insula, a door opens. Footsteps on the wooden stair, careful, quiet, not wanting to wake the household. The freedman from the third floor, perhaps, heading out early for work. Or the woman from the second floor who sells herbs in the morning market and must have her baskets ready before the crowds arrive. They pass through the courtyard and out into the street and are absorbed into the few figures already moving through the pre-dawn city. They carry their small lamp if they have one, or they move by the faint light of the sky, because the sky is growing now still dark, still starred at its zenith, but edging toward gray at the horizon. The Vigiles are still on their patrol. Their watch runs until the day relieves them, and these last hours before dawn are their quietest. The streets are as empty as they will get. The fires are not burning. The drunks are home or lying somewhere along a wall. The Vigiles walk their circuit in the growing pre-dawn, their torch now the brightest point of light in a street that is gradually, reluctantly, preparing to become a daytime street again. In the high room of the insula, the sleeping figure does not move. The blanket has shifted in the night, pulled to one side, and the wall above the sleeping mat catches the first pale suggestion of morning light from the window slit, a light that is not yet light, only the absence of full darkness, a gray-blue hint at what is coming. The brazier in the corner has been cold for hours. The shelf beside the door holds the clay lamp, empty of oil, extinguished. The small painted figures of the Lares are visible in the growing dimness, their arms in their ancient attitude, watching over the room as they have watched over every room like this, in every insula in Rome, every night for generations. The city breathes. The cart wheels are slowing now, a few still running, but the traffic beginning to thin as the approaching daylight signals to the drivers that their permitted hours are almost over. One last cart grinds through the street below the window. The sound of it passes, fades, and there is a moment, brief, imperfect, interrupted almost immediately by the creak of a door somewhere in the building, but a moment of something approaching stillness. The Tiber is moving in its banks, quiet and dark, and carrying the night's accumulated flow toward the sea. The ovens in the bakery are warm. The bread is cooling. The sky above thee is definitely lighter now, a pale line, thin as a knife edge, at the very top of the hill. The stars at the zenith are fading as the sky brightens, losing themselves in the growing blue, one by one, the way the stars always go, not all at once, but gradually, the brightest holding longest, Polaris steady almost until the end. Rome is still here. It will always be here, this city in one form or another, built and rebuilt, conquered and restored, damaged and patched and expanded and contracted, but always here, always with its streets and its hills and its river and its smell of stone and oil and old smoke and bread. The people who sleep in it now will wake into another ordinary day, which is all any day is, in any city in any century. But for another little while, The sleeping figure in the fourth-floor room does not need to know that. The day can wait. The lamp is out. The city breathes and breathes and breathes. End of script. A night in ancient Rome.